Today in the workshop, we'll be taking a look at the workshop. I'll show you how I converted a rundown work area into an efficient electronics workspace with custom workbenches and storage areas. Get ready to start the tour, and welcome to the workshop. Well, hello and welcome to the workshop and to a very different and rather special edition of the DroneBot Workshop. Today we are going to go on a tour of the DroneBot Workshop. Now, I've been asked to do this by many of you. I've had emails, comments, and videos from people saying, could we please have a tour of the workshop? Some other people have emailed me to ask about specific items in the workshop, such as my storage area, such as the items I have on my workbench, the power supplies, etc. that I have built into it. And they have asked, could you please do a video and show us all of this? Well, I have to admit, initially I was a little reluctant to do this, and the reason is, this is a very small workshop. I thought that a tour of a workshop this size was rather silly. I mean, after all, I'm sure many of you have bathrooms that are larger than this workshop. However, in thinking about it, the small size of the workshop is actually something that makes it unique. I think I've done a fairly good job, if I do say so myself, of using all of the space to its optimum potential. There is very little space in this workshop that has not been used. And what I really want this video to be is not so much a tour to show off the workshop, although I have to admit I'm rather proud of the workshop. It is more something to give you an idea of how to build a workshop or work area of your own. Now, I don't, of course, expect you're going to duplicate this workshop, but some of the things that I've done over here, some of the things that I've built into the workshop, some of the ways that I've arranged things may inspire you in building your own work area. And if that's the case, then the video has certainly served its purposes. Now, I don't actually have any video of the workshop being constructed, and that's probably a good thing. However, it was an interesting construction project, and I do have a number of pictures of that, and I'm going to show you some of those pictures in a moment. I have to tell you that I've never done anything like this before in my life. I've never done any construction work. I've never done framing, drywalling. I have done wiring, of course, before, but all of the other techniques were virtually foreign to me. I've done very little painting, and so most of this was a learning experience. And one thing that I'm rather proud of, if I can say that, is that I did this entirely myself. I didn't have any assistance whatsoever, and that even includes drywalling the ceiling. And if you've ever drywalled a ceiling by yourself, you know that it's not the easiest thing in the world to have an 8x4 sheet of drywall on the ceiling and try to fasten it into place all by yourself. But I managed to do it somehow, and I managed to do it relatively unscathed. In fact, the only accident that I had during the entire construction process was that I cut my thumb taking the price tag off of a 2x4, but otherwise I was very careful and took my time, and I think the results were actually quite good. I'm quite proud of it myself, and I think that's going to show in that video. Now, the amount of construction time, this workshop was created at the end of 2015. I started at the end of September 2015, and I worked on it basically every evening and every weekend because I was doing a consulting job at the time, so I couldn't work on it during the day. And I was putting paint on the walls while most of you were out celebrating New Year's Eve 2016, and most of the equipment in the workshop started to follow in the few weeks after that. So by January of 2016, this workshop had finally taken place. So let's start off and take a look at a little slideshow of how the workshop went together, and then I will show you all of the features of the workshop in detail. Now, the workshop didn't always look like this. As a matter of fact, it once looked like this, a complete disaster area. So time to clean it out and bring in some construction materials. I started off by doing some framing. Framing takes a lot longer than I expected it would. I brought in some drywall and bought some parts cabinets. I started to do some of the electrical wiring as well. Getting ready to mount the pegboard area and building a box around some pipes up on the ceiling. Now here's the pegboard. And here's the pegboard in blue. It's starting to look a little bit better already. And the box on the ceiling is ready too. Now I added some new insulation. And started drywalling the ceiling. And then the walls. It's looking a bit more like a room now. Now it's time to mud the drywall and primer it. And paint it. Now some of the frames and baseboards can be cut and painted. The pegboard is up now, and so is the mount for my video monitor. I've got my HDMI cable running through the wall, and now I put my LED lights up. Finished up some of the wiring, and let there be light. I assembled my drill press and put some carpet on the floor and the baseboards. Now it's time to start building some workbenches. One workbench completed. Now the second workbench. Here's a board that's going to mount the parts cabinets, and a small shelf as well to hold them. And the parts cabinets are up. And the video monitor makes an appearance. Now we'll build the drill press stand and the keyboard tray, and it's starting to look like a workbench. The drill press stand is ready, and the bench vise has been mounted. I'm just about ready to get work now. And the workshop is completed. Welcome to the workshop. Okay, now you've seen how I put the workshop together. It's time to begin our tour. Now I'm going to start with one of my workbenches. Many of you who've seen the videos before will know that I have two workbenches, one on each side of the workshop. I refer to one of them as my electronic electronics workbench, and the other one is my mechanical workbench. And the electronics workbench is where I do most of my Arduino work, Raspberry Pi work, where I do all my soldering, where I do my work with electronics. And the mechanical one is where I would put things together and use a lot of bigger tools, etc. Although there is a cross between the two workbenches. So we're going to start off by looking at the electronics workbench. Now here's the electronics workbench. I'll just show you everything on it going from left to right. First of all, starting on the bottom of the workbench, you'll notice that there's a pad over here, sort of a cream colored pad. This is an anti-static mat, and it's grounded in the back corner over there so that it dissipates any static electricity. So this is where I like to work on electronic components. I do not, however, recommend soldering over that. Now, going from this side over here are the items that I'm sure a lot of you have interest in, because many have asked about it. This is the output for some power supplies I have behind my workbench. I have two power supplies, a 12 volt and a 5 volt supply. The 12 volt handles more current than the 5 volt one, but they're both fairly high current, and they're switching power supplies. They're very small and very efficient. Now, the reason the 12 volt has more current than the 5 is that it also drives some LED lights that I'll show you in a moment that are up on the ceiling. If you recall that little box that when I built the workshop I had to put around those pipes, I turned that into a light fixture. And so these are the outputs of the power supply, and this green one is a ground that goes just to the household ground, the same ground that I've connected the anti-static mat to. Now over here I've got some jacks that do a variety of things. There's a computer, a desktop computer that's buried behind the workbench. You can't see it right now. It's a small computer that runs Ubuntu Linux 1604 and has a solid-state drive. And the computer's USB, I've got an extra connection to that that goes up over here. So when I'm working with Arduinos, for example, and want to connect to the USB port, that's where I connect to. Now this one that says KBD means keyboard. It's actually keyboard and mouse. It's rather interesting how I've got that. As you recall, I built a keyboard shelf over here, and I've got a keyboard and a mouse. The keyboard and the mouse are actually connected to an active USB hub, a powered USB hub. And one thing that I don't think you can see at the moment is on the side of the workbench I've got a switch that lets me switch where the output of that is going to. It can either be switched to go down to the computer below, and in that case the keyboard and mouse just control the computer, or it can be switched to go up to this jack. So if I'm using something like, let's say, a Raspberry Pi that needs a keyboard and mouse, I just connect into that and I can use the workbench keyboard and mouse with it. This HDMI connector, I've got a small switch, an HDMI switch buried behind here. It's infrared, and this is actually an infrared sensor for that switch. And in position number 1 of the switch, it just takes the HDMI output from the computer that's attached to the workbench, the desktop computer. In position 2, it goes over to here. So again, something like a Raspberry Pi, I can feed the HDMI output into that and view it on the video monitor that I've got mounted on the wall beside the workbench. And then finally, this is an Ethernet connection. I've got a 4-port Ethernet switch, a gigabit switch, mounted below the workbench, and one of the ports goes to here, another one goes to the desktop computer, and the other 2 go to the other workbench. I'll show you those in a moment. Now over here I've put a small audio amplifier. It's got a stereo audio amplifier module behind here, and this over here and behind there over there are speakers for that amplifier. This is the volume control for it, a power switch for it, and this switch allows me to select the inputs. When it's in this position on the far side, it takes the inputs from these 2 jacks. So if I'm doing any circuitry that has an audio out, I can feed it into that. In the other position, it goes to the sound card in the computer that's below the workbench, so I can get sound from the computer. I actually don't use it all as much as I thought I might. Now this is the control for the light that I mentioned that I've got built into that box above the workbench. I use two 5-meter LED strip lights, and because the controls I have, these little boxes that already came with controls, I took the controls out of the boxes. They just use pulse width modulation to control the brightness of the light. They can only handle one 5-meter strip each, so I've got an A and a B, so I've actually got it divided into two different segments, and that just powers the light on and off. Now this, of course, my soldering station. If you look behind the soldering station, there seems to be a third speaker. There actually isn't. That's just a hole, because behind here I've got the power supplies I mentioned that I use for the workbench, and so this just allows some ventilation, and there's also ventilation on either ends behind the workbench to allow air to pass through so that the power supply can get some ventilation. For the record, even under load, I've never really seen any appreciable heat from the power supply. You probably can't see too far into the corner, but I've just got a little storage thing where I keep things like extra tips for the soldering iron, extra soldering pads, solder braid, etc. Now over here, this is a circuit board holder that I find very handy for holding circuit boards when I'm soldering. I have this blue pad, and this blue pad is a silicone baking mat actually, and it's supposed to be good to up to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And I keep it over here so that when I'm soldering, if any little bits of solder drip down, which they inevitably do, they'll just get caught by the baking mat. So that's the top of the workbench. As you can see, I've got a power bar mounted on it like I do on my other workbench. Here is the keyboard drawer that I mentioned earlier and showed you earlier with just a keyboard and mouse. As I said, that's connected to an active USB hub. Now below this, I just keep a couple of things where I've got test cables, some wall warts over here, some power supplies, more soldering things like a soldering gun, and some other soldering irons. I also keep little containers. I like these little containers a lot for sorting things out. This is what I use for all of the jumper wires that I use on solderless breadboards, and I've got them sorted by size over here, so I find that very convenient. And I have other things in containers as well down here. Now below here I've got two drawers. This one over here is just some parts that I happen to just be using at the moment, so I want them on hand. And this drawer is where I keep a number of solderless breadboards for experimenting with. And then I just have more storage stuff below over here, like for example, these are a number of test leads for things like my oscilloscope and frequency counter and such, and more test equipment. I've got wire in this one over here. And finally, on the side over here, if you can see, you'll notice that I've got a anti-static strap, and it plugs in. I've got a jack here, and there's another jack probably out of your vision. You might be able to see that. Another jack on this side, so I can plug this in on either side. And these jacks are grounded. These anti-static straps already have a resistor built in, so you're not actually connecting yourself directly to ground, which would be dangerous. I just have a little hook to hang that up over here. So that essentially is my electronics workbench. So now let's move on to the next segment of the DroneBot Workshop tour. Alright, now that we've seen the electronics workbench, let's move over to the mechanical workbench. Now, as I said, this is where I would assemble items, use heavier tools, etc. This is where I'm assembling the robot. And also beside the workbench is where I have my drill press and a lot of storage for tools and such. So let's go and take a look at that right now. Now, I refer to this workbench as my mechanical workbench, but it's a bit of a misnomer. I mean, I've got things like power supply on it, and I've got test equipment above it, so it's clearly not all mechanical. But what I really mean by that is this is where I will do things that require assembly, like a chassis or something like that. Or if I need to use chemicals like isopropyl alcohol or flux remover, or if I'm using adhesives and glues or greases or anything like that, I'll work on that on this workbench as opposed to doing it on my electronics workbench. So let me give you a little view of it. There's really not as much to this workbench as there was to the other one. Now, as you can see, I've got a mat on here, a cutting mat, and it's permanently fastened down to the workbench. On the far side over here, I've got a bench vise. And in the spirit of using up all of the space that I can, I had a little piece of perf board left, so I created a little frame and hung a few tools onto that. There's a computer over here on this workbench as well. This is a little netbook. It also runs Ubuntu Linux, and it's got an SSD in it, and it's connected directly to the Ethernet. It uses one of the other ports from the Ethernet switch that I've got. I like connecting things directly to Ethernet as opposed to using Wi-Fi whenever I can. There's also another Ethernet connection over here, so again it can be used for electronics. And I've got my power supply down over here. Now this probably would have been more useful on the other workbench, but I simply didn't have the space, and I do make a lot of use out of it as well. Now, as you can tell, going on this side, I've got the drill press, and I've got a vise on the bottom, a drill press vise, and this is very handy. I've got some screws over here that I can loosen up so that I can move this vise back and forth and clamp it wherever I want it, and it lets me hold the material down, which is a very important safety thing, and one that's dear to my own heart, because when I was a younger man I had a very serious accident by not clamping something down on a drill press. Now, some may say that my drill press is a little close to the wall, and I can understand what you mean, but bear in mind that I'm usually drilling things like printed circuit boards or chassis, so the distance over here isn't really a problem for me. Now, over here I've got a little Android tablet, and it's mounted on one of these USB charger stands that has a few USB outputs on it. These little drawers here and those are really just more accessories for the drill. And now down over here, if I move back, the table that the drill press is on is where I store some other tools as well. Now, it's no coincidence that this set of drill bits fits in here, because I literally modeled the table after this set of drill bits. And below here we've got some other tools such as a socket set, a tap and die set, a number of accessories for my rotary tool. Down here I've got a couple of different electric drills and an electric jigsaw as well buried back in here. At the very bottom there's a heat gun and a hot glue gun. And back to the rest of the workbench over here, I've got some storage underneath here, and this is really just for things like tapes and adhesives and other various screws and things like that. I actually would like to reorganize that in a little while. Now, let me just move in front of your field of view for a second and show you that underneath here I've attached another one of my home-built LED lights, the one I made with strip lights, and I've got a switch on the wall here that I can use to vary the amount of light over here, and that provides some extra illumination on the workbench. And then of course on the top over here I've got a shelf where I'm holding my oscilloscope and my frequency counter and my signal generator. Now over here, some of you may have noticed these little clips I have. I use these to clip pieces of paper, things like schematic diagrams or pinouts, so that I can look at them when I'm working on things, and that's rather handy. And so there you go. It's a fairly basic workbench, really nothing spectacular about it, but I like it. It's very handy, and between it and the other workbench I have a lot of workspace to get things done. So now let's move on to the next segment of our tour. So now that we've taken a look at the two workbenches, it's time to focus on all the stuff that's behind me. There's a pegboard behind me, and there's storage areas for wire and for nuts and bolts and other pieces of hardware. Now, I also should mention that despite all of the tools I've got back here and all of the storage areas that you've seen and that you're about to see, it's not the complete story. The rest of my basement also has other tools, other storage storage areas. In fact, I have probably twice as much storage outside of the workshop as I do inside the workshop. Now, I'm not going to show you the rest of my basement today. That would make this tour way too long. But for those of you who are watching the video series on building a real robot, you're going to end up seeing a bit of it anyway, because this workshop is so small, I don't have enough space to run my robot around. So when the robot starts moving around, I'm going to take it out of the room and into the rest of the basement, so you'll get a glimpse at that. So that's just something to look forward to in the future, if that's the kind of thing you look forward to. But at any rate, let's go and take a look at all the things I have behind me, the pegboard and all the items below it. Now, the pegboard that you see behind me on most of my videos is, of course, just a place to store a lot of tools. And I like storing tools on pegboard. You might even have noticed in the slideshow I showed you of the horrible workshop that I used to have, there still was a piece of pegboard up over there. I like pegboard for storage of tools just because I find it very easy to access them, and because there's a definite place to put everything away when you're finished. And I like keeping the workshop neat and putting things away, not because that's the sort of person that I am, although I think I'm a rather neat person, but it's really just so that I can find them again. Whenever I need a pair of pliers or a screwdriver, I can just go and grab it. And as opposed to putting them all into a toolbox, I like to have the tools that I use the most on a pegboard. Now, I have other tools in other places. You saw some that were mounted below my drill press, but also in the other rooms I do have a toolbox with some additional tools, but the ones I use the most are up here in the pegboard. Interestingly enough, the thing that I'm proudest the most about the workshop has to do with the pegboard, and it's not the beautiful shade of blue that the pegboard is, but it has to do with the square and the ruler over here. And one thing that really amazes me is that when I built this room, one thing I certainly noticed was that the four corners were not the same size. This is the corner of a basement, and the floor tends to slope, and so the difference between the corner over here and the far corner over there is a full inch. And yet, despite the fact I'm on a sloping room, I managed to hang this pegboard up perfectly aligned, and you can tell with the ruler and the T-square, because the way that they're hanging, they're just supported by gravity, they are lined up perfectly with the holes in the pegboard, so I was really proud about that. At any rate, I just have a number of tools stored over here. The screwdrivers I use the most, some larger pliers and that. These cables up over here, a small Ethernet cable, a USB cable, and an HDMI I use on the electronics workbench to go to those jacks. I have a set of pliers over here, some smaller ones, pliers, diagonal cutters, wire strippers, etc. I use those things all the time. I've hung my rotary tool up over here as well. I've got two sets of nut drivers. These are SAE and these are metric ones. And over here, what I want to show you is the wire that I've got over here. Now, I've got all sorts of wire here. This wire over here is what they call wire wrap wire, but I find that great for wiring projects on perf board. This stuff is a bit larger. It's 20 gauge stuff. This is bus wire over here. And here's some heavier wire. This is 16 gauge speaker cable. This is 4 conductor cable. This is so-called power cord, the type you see coming out of a lot of the USB adapters. And these are both 18 gauge red and black wire. What I've done over here is I've got little dowels holding all the wires, and I have these I guess you call them doors or something, where I can open them up and I can push the dowel out so that when it comes time to replace a spool of wire, I just push the dowel back. Now, this parts cabinet back here is actually a throwback from the original workshop. The drawers are not. The drawers are new. I bought some new parts cabinets and used the same frame, which, if you'll notice from the original slideshow, I built into the wall over here, but the frame comes from some parts drawers that I purchased way back in the 1970s, and the original drawers were all cracked and brittle. But I use these to store nuts and bolts and things, so I've got them organized. I've got metric ones and SAE ones. I've also got things like tie wraps, and I've got DuPont connectors every size over here, and then all the pins you need, the male and female pins for the DuPont connectors here. And here's a little shelf where I just put a few other things. These are those sets of standoffs and things that I pick up, and a few extra tools and that on this shelf, and another shelf that I put here. And again, the whole idea is that I don't want to let any space here go to waste. So wherever I can put a small shelf or something, I put the shelf in order to store a few more things. And down on this side over here, way in the back, if you can see, I've got some hooks where I've got a number of jumper cables hanging. Got some more tiny screwdrivers, a number of screwdrivers over here, and screwdriver bits. I've literally got just about every bit that you can think of, including all the security bits, so I can work on just about anything with that. And because I can't reach over here being vertically challenged, I decided to use that space to hang my resistor color code chart. And so that is my pegboard arrangement. Now, one thing that you might have observed when I was showing you the storage area that I have over here, the little drawers and also the drawers at the bottom of my workbench, is that they're lined with a pink material. Well, that is actually anti-static material. I've got one of the drawers over here for you. This just has a number of Arduino Nanos and Pro Minis in it. And this material lines the plastic drawers in order to prevent the buildup of static electricity. And it is a fairly inexpensive material. The only problem with it is you can't seem to buy it in small quantities. And so this is what I've got left over from doing all of the drawers and all of those drawers down there and a number of other things in the other room. So it's great stuff. It's inexpensive, but you have to buy quite a bit of it. Now, before we finish our tour, I wanted to share with you a rather amusing little video that I found when I was digging through my archives of photos of the construction of the workshop. Now, as I said, I didn't take any video of myself constructing the workshop, but I did do a number of test videos once it was essentially complete. I did these test videos just because I wanted to see what it would be like to film in the workshop underneath all of these LED lights. So I was trying a number of different lighting combinations, and I ran into a video which shows the power supplies, among other things, that I'm using in the workbench, and you weren't able to see those because they're buried behind the workbench right now. So this will give you a glimpse at one of the power supplies and also the LED controls before they were taken out of their boxes. But one thing I need to warn you, you might want to send any small children or people with squeamish stomachs out of the room right now, because there's a rather rough character in the video. It's only 50 seconds long. The sound in it is not very good because I didn't have any microphones out, so it's just basically the sound that came out of the camera, but I think it is a bit amusing. So the rare, never seen before DroneBot Workshop video for your enjoyment. Okay, this is a test recording over here to see how this actually works in the workshop. Haven't done this before, so just trying to get an angle on how things are. At any rate, what we're going to do over here is we're going to just take a look at some stuff here. I've got this wonderful power supply here that I'd like to show you. Isn't it beautiful? Yes. Okay, and these little dimmer doohickeys, we're going to take one of these apart. Isn't that going to be great? And here's a beautiful solderless breadboard. So let's just see how that turned out. Alright, well, that last video was a little bit scary, and if you ever see that scruffy guy, I wouldn't approach him. But other than that, I hope that you've enjoyed this tour of the DroneBot Workshop, and I especially hope that it's inspired you to build or enhance your own work area. Now, I've had many hours of fun inside this workshop, and I'm sure that if you put something like this together yourself, you'll experience the same thing. Now, unlike some of my other videos or most of my other videos, there is not an equivalent article on the DroneBot Workshop website for this video. However, I invite you to go to dronebotworkshop.com, where you will find all sorts of tutorials and projects for you to build in your own workshop. And while you are there, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the newsletter. And I've got an announcement about the newsletter I'd like to make right now. Now, I know it's been a little while. It's been over a month, actually, since I've managed to get a newsletter out. I apologize for that. I've just been very, very busy, especially building a robot, which I'm sure some of you have seen on the Thursday series of Build a Real Robot. But I will be getting a newsletter out this week. I'm going to use the time I saved not creating an article for the video in order to get out a newsletter. And in the newsletter, I'm going to be announcing a new method for suggesting content for the workshop, because the real purpose of the newsletter is for you to be able to tell me what it is you would like to be seeing. Now, I've got a lot of suggestions by email, many suggestions and comments on the videos. In fact, this video itself was a result of many suggestions you have made. But going forward, I have a new method for doing this, and I'm going to be announcing that in the next newsletter and in every subsequent newsletter, as well as in the welcome letter that you're going to get when you sign up for the newsletter. And this new method will allow me to find out exactly what it is you would like me to make and what videos and articles you would like to have from the DroneBot Workshop. And if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, well, please do. I'd be very thrilled to have you as one of my subscribers. So until next time, take care of yourself. If you have a workshop, have fun in it. If you don't, well, have fun building one. And I hope to see you again very soon here in the DroneBot Workshop. Goodbye for now.